The bell above the door at Water Street Roasters gave one thin ring, and Sienna Marlowe set her leather satchel on the counter beside her elbow, while she waited for her flat white. Her phone was pressed to her ear, and on the other end Desmond Crane's voice moved with its usual unhurried certainty. "Just hold off on the wire until I confirm with the vendor," he was saying. "We don't want anything traceable before Thursday." She said something non-committal, took her coffee, and walked out onto the sidewalk without the satchel. 3 tables away, Grady Whitlock had been sitting with a black coffee going cold in front of him, sleeves of his canvas jacket pushed to the elbow, a fresh scrape across 2 knuckles from a water heater he'd wrestled with that morning. He watched the satchel sit there a beat too long. Then he stood, picked it up, heavier than it should have been, the zipper not quite closed, and caught up to her at the corner before the light changed. He held it out. "Didn't say much. You forgot this." She took it, stunned, already reaching for words of thanks, and by the time she'd found them he was already crossing back against the light, hands in his pockets, like the whole exchange had cost him nothing at all. Sienna stood on the corner of Water Street with the bag against her chest and watched him go. He didn't look back. He walked into the coffee shop, sat back down at his table, and finished the coffee he'd left going, cold, unhurried, like a man who had simply misplaced 10 minutes of his morning and was now getting them back. By 11 that morning she was at her desk on the 3rd floor of the Marlowe Trust building on Duke Street, the harbor gray and flat through the window behind her. She opened the satchel again, slower this time. $50,000 in banded hundreds. She counted it twice. Nothing missing, not a single bill. The cash had come out of the trust's operating account that morning, under an emergency disbursement. Desmond had pushed through before 9, tagged as an urgent vendor, settlement, off the normal cycle. She hadn't questioned it at the time. She'd been half listening, thinking about the quarterly report, and had initialed the authorization without really reading it. She tried to remember the stranger's face and came up mostly with impressions: gray eyes, a jaw that didn't relax even when the rest of him did, the particular economy of the way he'd moved, like every motion had already been budgeted for. She sat on the board of the Lunenburg Waterfront Business Association, which meant she had access to the security footage that covered most of the historic district. She pulled the 9:15 clip that evening, alone, with the office door locked. There he was, sitting with his coffee, upright the second she walked past, following her out, catching her at the corner, coming back inside and sitting down like nothing had happened at all. That last part was the detail that wouldn't let her go. A man who had just handed back $50,000 in cash and then gone back to finish a coffee that was already lukewarm. She asked her assistant, Marguerite Doyle, to run the plate on the gray pickup that had pulled out from behind the shop 12 minutes later. Marguerite had been with the Marlowe family for 19 years, ever since Sienna's father had hired her fresh out of the co-op program at Dalhousie. She paused, half a second, no more, before she handed back an address on a slip of paper. Sienna noticed the pause. She didn't ask about it. The house was out past the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the yards thinned into split-rail fences and stands of birch. Sienna parked across the road. Grady wasn't in his own yard. He was 2 properties over, kneeling by a neighbor's collapsed fence post, tamping gravel into the hole with the flat of a shovel. A girl sat on the porch steps of the house Sienna had come looking for, 7 or 8, dark hair, escaping a braid, a paperback held open across her knees, an old stuffed fox tucked against her hip. He looked up and recognized her immediately. His face closed the way a door closes, not slammed, just quietly and completely shut. She crossed the road with a plain envelope in her hand, no note on it. She stopped at the edge of the property line, the way you'd stop at the edge of someone else's water. "For the bag," she said, "$500. It isn't a reward, it's just a thank you." He set the shovel down against the post, straightened, wiped his palms on his jeans. "It isn't that I don't need it," he said, voice lower than she remembered from the sidewalk. "I just don't want it like that." He turned back to the fence. The girl on the porch closed her book over one finger. "Dad," she called. "Who's that?" He didn't turn around. Someone passing through. Sienna stood there a moment longer with the envelope still in her hand, then folded it back into her coat, walked to her car, and sat with the key in the ignition for a long time before she turned it. A man who mended a neighbor's fence for nothing. A man who wouldn't take $500 for handing back $50,000. The arithmetic didn't work, and she couldn't leave a problem alone once she'd noticed it. She couldn't let it go. The next evening, after a board call she barely remembered sitting through, she drove out past the edge of town again, not looking for anything in particular, and found the gray pickup parked outside the community health clinic on Cornwallis Street, a low brick building with a hand-painted sign that hadn't been repainted in a decade. She parked 2 streets over and walked back through air that smelled like the harbor and impending snow. The clinic had a side window into one of the exam rooms, blinds drawn most of the way down. Through the gap at the bottom she could see the edge of an exam table and the lower half of 2 men, one in scrubs, one in flannel. A teenager lay on the table, his shirt dark along one side. Grady's gloved hands moved with a rhythm that made it hard to look away. The needle, in and out at the same depth. Each time, no wasted motion, the thread drawn tight with a small economical tug. The clinic doctor stood with his arms crossed, watching, not helping, studying. Sienna turned away before either man could glance toward the window. She drove home and sat at her kitchen island with her coat still on and her laptop open. Grady Whitlock, Nova Scotia, turned up nothing that fit. A retired dairy inspector in Truro, a hockey coach in Antigonish. She tried Grady Whitlock, Master Corporal, and the third result was an archived release from the Department of National Defense. The photo showed a younger man in dress uniform, same eyes, jaw a little less weathered. Master Corporal Grady Whitlock, Canadian Armed Forces Health Services, recipient of a Medal of Military Valor for Combat Casualty Care. The date was 9 years back. She sat with one hand still on the trackpad for a long time. The man who'd handed back her satchel wasn't only an honest stranger. He had been somebody once, and had chosen deliberately to become no one in particular. She closed the laptop without searching further. Some doors weren't hers to open just because she'd found the handle. The next morning was the quarterly trust meeting. Sienna sat at the head of the long table with the harbor gray through the window behind her, and Desmond Crane sat to her right. The way he had for 11 years, moving through the agenda with the easy rhythm of a man who'd been running these meetings since before she'd finished university. On item 6, he tabled a $2.1 million disbursement to a numbered consulting firm registered out of Moncton. Marguerite's pen hovered over the sign-off sheet. Her hand began, very slightly, to shake. She signed anyway. Sienna watched Marguerite's hand, then watched Desmond. "I'd like to see the full engagement contract before that goes out," she said. The room went still in the particular way rooms with old money in them go still. Desmond's mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Of course, Sienna. Whatever puts your mind at ease." He moved to item 7. She didn't look at her notes again for the rest of the meeting. She went back to the house on the edge of town 3 evenings later, in the slow blue light before dark. She left her blazer in the car and wore a plain sweater. She didn't bring an envelope this time. Grady was on the porch, sanding down a rough step edge. A bicycle lay on its side in the grass, chain off, front tire flat. He looked up and didn't stand. "Mr. Whitlock." She kept her hands loose at her sides. "I want to ask you something professional, not a reward." He set the sandpaper down. She told him about the Trust's rural outreach program. Mobile clinics for the counties along the South Shore where the nearest hospital was 90 minutes on a good road. They needed someone who understood field medicine and low resources, someone who'd worked in real conditions and not from behind a hospital desk. He didn't answer for a while. "I don't practice anymore." "I know," she said, quieter. "I saw you at the clinic." He went still in a different way than before, not closed, held. "Personal reasons," he said. She nodded and didn't push. That was when the girl came down the steps with her backpack still on, saw Sienna, and stopped. "Hi," Sienna said. "Hi." The girl studied her the way children study things they haven't decided about yet. "My tire's flat. I can see that." Grady crossed to the bike, worked the tire off the rim with his thumbs, found the puncture in 3 seconds, patched it from a kit his daughter fetched from the kitchen drawer without being asked. The movements had the same unhurried precision as the suturing. Sienna watched the girl watch her father watch Sienna. "Dad," the girl said, "can she stay for supper?" He didn't answer right away. He smoothed the patch, pumped the tire, tested the pressure with his palm. Then he nodded once, and that was the whole answer. The kitchen smelled like onions and butter. The light fixture over the table hadn't been changed since sometime in the 80s and gave everything a warm, amber cast. Spaghetti, a plain salad, a jug of water. The girl, Poppy, she said her name was, When Sienna finally asked, talked easily, twirling pasta on her fork. My mom used to draw maps, Poppy said. Not real ones, made-up ones. A whole country with 5 rivers and a city where everybody lived in lighthouses instead of houses. That sounds wonderful, Sienna said. She knew all the star names too, like all of them. She used to tell me what people in different places called them, way back. Grady set his fork down without a sound and picked it back up. His knuckles went pale around the handle. The wedding band was still on his left hand. Sienna noticed it without meaning to. What happened to her? Sienna asked gently. She got sick, Poppy said, 2 years ago, almost 3. She said it the flat, practiced way children say things they've lived inside long enough to carry without flinching. Grady's eyes stayed on his plate. After supper, Poppy hugged Sienna at the door without asking permission, quick and complete, and then was gone up the stairs to brush her teeth. Grady walked Sienna to her car. Thank you, she said. He looked out at the dark yard, then back at her. She doesn't usually do that. I know. He held the car door for her and closed it once she was in. She didn't start the engine right away. She sat with her hands on the wheel and watched the warm square of the kitchen window until the light went out inside. The next 2 working days, Sienna buried herself in the trust's accounts. She asked Marguerite for a year and a half of invoices from the Moncton consulting firm. Marguerite said she'd have them Thursday. Thursday came and went. Friday came and went. Sienna went into Marguerite's office and shut the door. Marguerite. The older woman set her glasses down and didn't look up. Sienna, she said, please, don't dig there. That was all. She turned back to her screen, hands flat on the desk so they wouldn't tremble. Sienna watched her a moment, didn't press, and closed the door behind her. She drove out to the house that evening. Grady was on the porch with a mug. Poppy's bedroom light was already off. Sienna sat in the chair across from him without waiting to be invited and set a question between them, the way you'd set down something breakable. If a family trust withdraws $50,000 in cash on a weekday morning for an emergency vendor payment, she said, what would that tell you? He didn't answer for a long time. A truck passed on the next street over. A dog barked twice and stopped. Cash of that size moved that fast out of a nonprofit, he said finally, comes down to about 3 things. Bribes, payoffs to keep someone quiet, or laundering. He said it the way a doctor reads a chart, flat, no ornament. Look at who signed the requisition, that's where it starts. She studied the line of his jaw in the porch light. How do you know that, exactly? He didn't look at her. I knew someone once who learned it the hard way. He didn't say more. She didn't ask more. They sat in the quiet for what felt like a long time and was probably 4 minutes. When she stood to go, he stood too and just watched her from the top of the steps, hands in his pockets, until her taillights turned the corner. She drove straight to the trust building and let herself in through the side entrance. The lobby was dark except for the night desk. The guard nodded without a word. He'd known her since she was a teenager. In her office, she pulled the original requisition from the archive. 50,000. Off-cycle. Vendor name redacted in the beneficiary field. Signature at the bottom, Desmond G. Crane. She sat with the screen lighting her face and didn't move for a while. Outside, the harbor was a black sheet, a single fishing boat's light crawling somewhere out past the breakwater. For most of her adult life, when something cracked open under her, she called the family's lawyer. Tonight she scrolled past his name. Scrolled past Marguerite. Scrolled past her mother. She stopped on a number saved without a last name. He picked up on the second ring. Grady, I need you to tell me what to do next. A pause on the line, not hesitation, calculation. Don't put anything in writing, he said. Don't tell Marguerite anything more than you already have. And don't sleep at your own place tonight. She closed her eyes. All right. Sienna met Desmond in his office the next morning at 9. The room had belonged to her grandfather once. The carpet was older than she was. He poured her coffee without asking if she wanted it. Sienna, he said, leaning back, I've been worried about you. She held the cup and didn't drink. You've been under a great deal of strain, he went on. Your father carried more than he ever let on. I watched it wear him down. I don't want to watch that happen to you. His voice was warm. His eyes weren't moving with it. Take some time, Muskoka, or somewhere further. Let me handle the routine items. We can revisit the larger questions once you're rested. I'll think about it, she said, and set the cup down untouched. She didn't stop walking until she was alone in the elevator. That afternoon, Grady was at the Municipal Works Annex on King Street. replacing brushes on a backup generator, the smell of ozone thick in the small room, the window cracked to vent it. Through the gap he heard a voice from the office next door, even, unhurried, unplaceable at first. "Beaumont," the voice was saying. "Desmond here. Listen, Sienna's been showing some signs, fixated on paperwork she has no business chasing. I'd like a wellness check ready to go, if it comes to that. She's got assets that could get badly mismanaged if this isn't handled carefully." Grady's screwdriver stopped against the brass panel. He didn't look up at the window. He counted to 5 in his head, the way he'd once counted to 5 before answering a question in a debrief. The voice went on. "Yes, Sienna Marlowe, old family friend." Grady finished the last screw, slow, then a quarter turn more. He packed his tools into the canvas bag one at a time, carried it down the back stairs, and didn't call her from the parking lot. He drove home. Poppy had a hard night. She came into the kitchen at 10 in her socks and pajamas, the stuffed fox by one ear. "I had a dream the door was open and you weren't there." He picked her up. She was almost too big for it now, and carried her back upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed. "Dad," she said into his shoulder, "are you sad sometimes?" "Yes. Like all the time, sometimes more than others." She was quiet a while. "Is Sienna coming back for supper?" He didn't answer. When her breathing evened out, he went back downstairs and stood at the counter for a full minute before he picked up his phone and called. She answered on the second ring. "You're being watched," he said. "How do you know?" He looked at the dark window over the sink. "Because I used to be the kind of person they send to do the watching." Marguerite asked to meet at a diner in Bridgewater, on the other side of the river, a place with cracked vinyl booths where nobody from the trust ever went for lunch. Sienna got there first. Marguerite came in with her coat still buttoned and didn't take it off. She slid a small brass key across the table. "I have to say this all at once," Marguerite said. "Don't ask anything until I'm finished." Sienna put her hand over the key. "Desmond's been routing money through that Moncton firm for almost 3 years, Marguerite said. "It isn't a consulting company, it's a pass-through. The people on the receiving end are witnesses in a federal fraud case involving his nephew. He's been paying them to disappear. He's been using the trust to do it." Sienna didn't move. "My son found it first," Marguerite went on. "Owen, he was an analyst here, brought it to me in the spring of last year. I told him to take it to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit." Her voice cracked once and she pushed through it. 6 weeks later he was cycling home on the shore road and a dark SUV ran him into the ditch and didn't stop. He lived. Broken pelvis, a ruptured spleen. They couldn't prove intent. He's been in protective custody for 14 months now. He's all I have, Sienna. Sienna wrapped her fingers around the key. It was warm from Marguerite's hand. "Everything's in a safety deposit box at the credit union in Bridgewater," Marguerite said. "Transfer records, off-book ledgers, an audio file. I can't be the one who walks in there. If Desmond's people see me, my son is dead." She nodded at the key. "You need someone outside all of this. Someone whose name isn't on a single one of our documents." Sienna already knew who. She drove out to the house that evening. Grady was on the porch when she pulled in. He'd been waiting, though she hadn't told him she was coming. She came up the steps and set the key on the small table between the 2 chairs without saying anything yet. He looked at it a long time. "If I do this," he said, "I don't get to go back to being nobody. Not after." "I know. Poppy doesn't either." "I know," she said again, quieter. He picked up the key, turned it once between his fingers. "I'm not asking you to," she said. "You're not asking, I'm hearing it anyway." He held the key a moment longer. "I'll go," he said, "for this town, for Poppy." A pause and he didn't look away from her. "And for you." The sentence ended on the word "you" and stayed there. Sienna sat down in the chair across from him because she didn't trust her own legs. He went inside. She heard him on the stairs, then the low murmur of a good night in his daughter's room. He came back down in a clean shirt and a canvas coat. "We go before the morning shift changes at the bank," he said, and switched off the porch light himself. The drive to Bridgewater took just under an hour. They barely spoke. The road was empty except for a salt truck near Chester Basin. The credit union opened at 8. Grady went in alone. Sienna waited in the truck. The box was the size of a shoebox, and taped inside the lid was a card in Marguerite's handwriting. Passcode is her mother's maiden name plus the year they married. Sienna knew both. They were back on the road by 8:20. Grady didn't take the highway home. He took the back route past the old railbed toward Mahone Bay. 2 lanes, woods pressing close on both sides, no signal in the low ground. They were maybe 10 minutes outside town when a black SUV pulled in tight behind them. A second one came over the rise ahead and slowed sideways across both lanes. Grady braked smoothly, no jerk, and eased the truck onto the shoulder. "Stay in here," he said. "Lock the door behind me. If anything goes wrong, slide over and drive. Don't wait for me." Grady locked the door. He got out. 3 men climbed from the 2 vehicles, none in uniform, one holding a pistol low against his thigh the way people do when they think no one's watching. Sienna pressed the lock down. What happened next took, by her count afterward, under 30 seconds. Grady walked toward the first man with his hands open. Then the open hands weren't open anymore. He had the pistol off the man's hip in one motion, and the man's wrist bent the wrong way with a sound she heard even through the glass. The second man came in swinging a length of pipe. Grady stepped inside the arc, took the elbow, and the man was face down on the gravel, with his arm folded behind him before Sienna had finished flinching. The third man saw enough and ran for the tree line. There was nothing showy in any of it. No anger, only function. Grady came back to the truck, knuckles scraped from the gravel, breathing slightly harder than before, nothing more. "We need to move," he said. "There'll be a second team inside the hour." He drove without talking for 10 minutes, then pulled into a gas station outside Mahone Bay and used a payphone she hadn't known still existed. "Beaumont," he said. "I need extraction logistics. Federal handoff, Halifax, 24 hours. A pause. "Yes, the material's hot. Your call on the drop point." He hung up. The safe house was a timber cabin 3 kilometers outside town, owned by a man he'd served with overseas who wasn't home. The key was under a flower pot of frozen soil. Inside, a low lamp, a propane stove, snow starting to come down past the window over the lake. He made tea. Sitting at the table, he told her the rest. The training, 2 overseas tours, the medal he never mentioned, meeting Elowen, her diagnosis 5 years in, 11 months from the day they found it to the day she was gone. How he couldn't put his hands inside anyone again after that. How he'd turned in his active file, kept his reserve status quiet, and come home to the edge of a small town so his daughter could grow up somewhere without medevac helicopters overhead. Sienna reached across the table. Her hand covered his. He didn't pull away. He didn't close his fingers around hers either. He just let her hand stay there. They were in Halifax by 10 the next morning. The federal prosecutor's office looked out over the harbor from the 11th floor. The prosecutor, Odette Prescott, had known Grady from 2 postings back, when she'd still been in uniform herself. She took the file. She listened to Sienna for 40 minutes and to Grady for 20 more. She asked 5 questions and made 1 call. By noon, 2 RCMP financial crimes investigators were in the next office going through the drive. Sienna was midway through her second sworn statement when Grady's phone buzzed on the table. His mother-in-law's name. She lived 4 streets from him and had been keeping Poppy overnight. He picked up, listened, and Sienna watched something in his face break for exactly 1 second before it sealed shut again. "How long ago?" he said. "Were they in uniform? What did they show you?" A pause. "Get inside. Lock everything. Don't open the door for anyone with a badge until I'm there." He stood. "2 officers went to my mother-in-law's an hour ago," he said. "Emergency child welfare order. Concerns about the father's stability." Odette was already on her feet before he finished. "Go, I'll make the calls from here." He was already at the door. Sienna grabbed her coat. "Stay," he said without turning around. No, he didn't argue. They drove north through the afternoon and into the dark. New Brunswick blurred past, then the Nova Scotia border, the road narrowing under an early snow. He held 3 over the limit the whole way and never let himself become a man in a hurry that anyone could pull over. He didn't say a word about Poppy. He didn't have to. They reached the Lunenburg detachment a little after 1 in the morning. A desk officer looked up. A man Sienna recognized as Detective Beaumont came out of the back hallway, hands open in front of him. "Mr. Whitlock, we have your daughter in an interview room. There's a process." Grady didn't break stride. He took a black trefold from the inside pocket of his jacket, not the wallet most men carried, and flipped it open one-handed at chest height. The Federal Reserve credentials inside had been reactivated 18 hours earlier by a single phone call. "Master Corporal Grady Whitlock, Canadian Armed Forces Health Services Reserve," he said. "I'm here for my daughter." Beaumont looked at the card, then at the man holding it, and stepped aside. Grady walked past him without another word. Sienna followed. Poppy was in a small carpeted room at the end of the hall with a caseworker and a spare stuffed animal in the corner that Poppy wasn't holding. She had her knees pulled to her chest on a beige sofa. She looked up when the door opened. She didn't run to him. She stood very slowly, the way a child stands when she's decided not to cry, and then walked 4 steps and put her face against her father's chest. He knelt and held her without a word, one hand between her shoulder blades, one at the back of her neck where her hair had come loose from its braid. The caseworker looked at the floor and stepped out. They walked out of the detachment 10 minutes later into an empty parking lot under humming lights, snow coming down thin and sideways. Grady held Poppy there for a long moment, his shoulders shaking once, only once. Sienna stood 3 steps back, not wanting to be inside whatever was happening between them. Then, Poppy lifted her face from his shoulder and looked across the lot at Sienna. She put one hand out. Sienna crossed to her and took it. The 3 of them stood there under the lights and didn't say anything at all. Their breath made small clouds and then nothing. The wind pushed the dry snow across the pavement. 2 days later, federal agents arrested Desmond Crane at Halifax Stanfield, a one-way ticket to Nassau in his jacket pocket and a passport carrying a name that was almost his own. He was photographed in handcuffs walking through the terminal. The Trust's emergency board meeting convened by 10 that morning and voted unanimously to remove him before lunch. Owen Doyle came out of protective custody that same week. Marguerite met him on the platform at the Bridgewater train station, with a coat that was too big for him now, and put it around his shoulders and held him for a long time. Sienna watched from a distance and didn't intrude. When Marguerite finally turned and saw her there, she crossed the platform and hugged her too. 19 years had passed between the 2 of them at the Trust, and it was the first time either had embraced the other. Sienna looked at the Trust differently after that, not as something to be preserved the way it had always been, but as something to actually be used. She rewrote its mission statement at her own kitchen table over one long weekend, and asked Grady to consult, part-time, on his own terms, on a rural trauma response initiative for the South Shore counties. He didn't answer for a while. He sat with his hands around a coffee mug, watching Poppy on the living room rug, stacking 3 books into a careful tower. Then he nodded. That was the whole answer. He didn't need to say yes out loud. 6 months later, in late spring, the lilacs along the harbor path finally bloomed, a full 2 weeks behind the rest of the province, but bright the way late things sometimes are. Grady's porch on a Saturday afternoon. The neighbor's fence had been finished months ago, and he'd been paid in jars of maple syrup that now lined the kitchen shelf. Inside, Poppy lay on the rug with a hardcover book open across her stomach and the stuffed fox against her ear, nearly 9 now, reading with the same quiet focus her mother once had. Outside, 2 chairs faced the small yard, a painted table between them, holding 2 mugs and a stapled grant proposal, 20 pages thick. It was a plan for 3 mobile trauma units to serve the province's most rural counties starting in the fall. The Trust was covering 40%. The province was matching the rest. Grady had walked every proposed route on a paper map himself and written the staffing model in his own hand. Sienna read the last page out loud. "I'd like to name one of the units for Elowen." He didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the water, the harbor a thin pale line past the rooftops, a single sailboat moving slow across it. "She'd have liked that," he said. His voice didn't break, it only slowed. The wedding ring was still on his left hand. He hadn't taken it off. Sienna had stopped thinking of it as a question that needed answering. His right hand rested on the arm of his chair between them. Her hand was over it. She hadn't put it there with any particular thought. He hadn't pulled away. The screen door opened behind them. Poppy came out in her socks, holding the book against her chest, looked at the 2 of them, and walked between the chairs to sit on the step at their feet. She leaned her head against Sienna's knee. Sienna rested a hand on the girl's hair. Poppy opened the book to a page with a small ink drawing of a paper boat on a single wavy line, her mother's handwriting in the margin, and began to read aloud, soft, the wind off the harbor carrying some of the words away before Sienna could catch them. She didn't need to catch every word. Grady listened. His fingers turned under Sienna's hand and closed around it gently, and then opened again. The late light moved along the side of the house. He hadn't returned the bag for a reward. She hadn't followed him for a story. Neither of them had been looking for anything at all, and that was the only reason either of them could trust that this was real.